This is the U.S. Report with James Morrow.
Good evening and welcome to the program. Another week of crisis in the Middle East, and the U.S. is in the thick of it. So let's find out what's going on. Coming up tonight, Biden back home after his high-stakes trip to Israel. But what did his visit really achieve? We'll break that down with Middle East expert Michael Doran. Also tonight, hundreds of anti-Israel protesters stormed the Washington Capitol demanding a ceasefire. But don't you dare call it an insurrection. That's only for the Trumpers. Plus, Republican Jim Jordan fails to win the House Speaker's gavel in a second vote. Does this spell more trouble inside the Republican Party? Mick Mulvaney will have a lot more to say on that later in the show. But first, Joe Biden's not-so-excellent adventure. This week, the U.S. president decided to insert himself into the rapidly escalating conflict in the Middle East, which, let's not forget, started with Hamas terrorists streaming out of the unoccupied Gaza Strip. That's right, Israel unoccupied it in 2005 to wreak death and destruction across southern Israel. Now, we're nowhere near an endgame with this crisis, but so far we have seen, and again, I've got to say, some viewers might find this content distressing, the following events. First, we've seen Israel hit back somewhat against Gaza ahead of what is expected to be a full-scale invasion. We've also seen Hamas lie that the Israelis blew up one of their hospitals to garner sympathy in the world media. And we've also seen demonstrations around the world, firebombs thrown at American embassies in the Middle East. Plus, of course, now, the potential for further terrorist attacks abroad and even a proper regional hot war in the region that could draw the U.S. and Russia into conflict. Great stuff all around. And this is who the U.S. puts into the mix?
Years ago, I asked the Secretary of State when he and I were working in the Senate to write something for him, and he said, he wrote a line that I think is appropriate. He said, it's not, we lead, not just, well, I won't go into it. I'll wait till later.
Anyway, while in the Middle East, Joe Biden met with Benjamin Netanyahu. The other local leaders all kiboshed a summit that was supposed to have taken place in neighboring Jordan. And he had this to say about that explosion in what appears now to have been a hospital car park in Gaza that was caused by a Palestinian missile gone astray.
Based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you.
The other team? Look, I know the president likes to play that he's Al Bundy, reminiscing about scoring the winning touchdown for Polk High, but he couldn't even say the words? Palestinian Islamic Jihad? The guys who actually shot the missile? At the same time, while there are believed to be 203 hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza, around 30 of them American citizens, Biden also did this. He offered Gaza $100 million to Hamas in unconditional foreign aid. Again, unconditionally, without any requirement that Hamas hand back anyone, not even the Americans. This is a guy who just traded $6 billion for 5 Americans in Iran, but what are you going to do? It's insane and it's disgraceful, because it seems Biden really is trying to do the whole both sides thing here. He has a long history of this too, remember? Back in 2001, long before he started sundowning, but just after 9/11, Biden was the head of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Powerful committee. And according to this profile in the very liberal New Republic magazine published just weeks afterwards, here's an account of what went down in a meeting with staffers, according to the story. Biden said, quote, "Seems to me this would be a good time to send, no strings attached, a check for $200 million to Iran," Biden declared. Biden surveyed the table with raised eyebrows. How do you like that? Look on his face. That's from the New Republic, and this, friends, is who we're dealing with. And just as the money he released to Iran through the lifting of sanctions and other means has gone to fund terrorism, it's a pretty clear bet that the $100 million in aid he has promised to Hamas in Gaza will be used to torture hostages and kill Jews and enrich the corrupt Palestinian leadership. Even CNN was skeptical. Check out this interview with Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner.
Is the U.S. then essentially in a position where it has to take the word of Hamas that it will not be taken? I mean, what other guarantee can there be?
We believe there is an understanding now among all of the players who control that crossing, the Rafah crossing in Egypt.
An understanding. Lovely. With Hamas, a gang of terrorist butchers. This gross, casual moral obtuseness is precisely why I think the Biden administration has helped contribute to so much of the chaos we presently see in the world. It can be explained, I think, by one of the great fallacies of American foreign policy that has infected it since at least World War II. Story time. Back when I was at university, one of my international relations professors summed it up this way. He said, 90% of the world's problems could be traced back to Americans just wanting to be liked. Simple saying, but if you think about it, it makes sense. Because that idea, that desire to be liked, all too often runs up in the world against systems and societies and cultures where the key is not being liked, but being respected, being feared even. Osama bin Laden, the al-Qaeda chief who killed 3,000 Americans on 9/11 and baited the U.S. into horribly destructive forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, had a saying. And I'm not quoting him because I approve of him, just the opposite. May he burn in hell. But Osama bin Laden was famous for his knowledge of power politics and how the game worked in the Middle East. According to bin Laden, this could be summed up with the phrase, when people see a strong horse and a weak horse, they will like the strong horse. In other words, if you're too eager to please, well, you're the weak horse. If you're outsourcing, as the Obama and really the Biden administration as well, the job of security in the Middle East to Iran, a country which calls you the great Satan, again, you're the weak horse. If you're standing in the way of your purported allies doing what they need to do to eliminate their enemies who just slaughtered 1,400 of their civilians, you're the weak horse. Do I have to spell it out anymore? Under Joe Biden, in a continuation of the disastrous foreign policy of Barack Obama that was only briefly interrupted by Donald Trump, Israel is ultimately to be thrown over. Despite being a democracy in a part of the world where democracies are few and far between. And they're going to be thrown over in favor of Iran, which in 2014 Barack Obama said was run by strategic, rational people, he said, who respond to costs and benefits and incentives from the West. Well, I guess in a sense, he got that right. Now, Obama's successor, proxy even, Joe Biden, is having to cope with the utter, horrific, world-shaking catastrophe of Hamas invading Israel from her south via Gaza, massacring, again, more than 1,000, taking 203 more captive with funding that came directly from Iran. This one major reason why Biden's trip to the Middle East will ultimately not bear fruit, in the short run or the long run. His administration is compromised, it is stuck with a policy that regards Iran as legitimate, and Israel as a bit, Biden has allowed America to become the weak horse, and Iran the strong horse. Not that, of course, Iran or any of America's enemies in the Middle East had to consider Biden's weakness for very long.
I spoke to him. I learned a long time ago what you all learned in your life. someone's going through something that is beyond their comprehension, if they ever thought they'd have to go through.
Behind your comprehension, all right. What I wouldn't give for a strong horse right now. To discuss this and much more, let's bring in my first guest. Joining me now is Michael Doran, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East at the Hudson Institute. Michael, thanks so much for coming back this week. Let's talk, first of all, about the trip that Joe Biden just made to Israel. What do you think he has achieved, if anything?
Well, thanks for having me, James. Great to be here. I think that he achieved a number of things. If we look at it from a political point of view, I think it was a success for him, particularly among pro-Israel voters. The feeling among the pro-Israel community in Washington is that this is one of the most stellar moments in the history of U.S.-Israeli relations. The Bret Stephens, conservative, anti-Trump conservative, a columnist in the New York Times, called it Biden's finest hour, and presented it as one of the most pro-Israel moves in the history of U.S.-Israeli relations. The Israelis also were greatly heartened by it. There were people who were deeply moved by the words that Biden spoke there. So I think, all in all, a success. But under the surface, there's something else going on, which some of the Israelis have started to notice as well, and they're calling it a bear hug. This is he's gripping them very tight and saying that it's all about love. But the Israelis are feeling significantly constrained because Biden doesn't want them to upset his Iran policy, doesn't want them to the war to expand into Lebanon, doesn't want them to go too far in Gaza, and so he's got them kind of on a tight leash.
And Biden has spoken, he's given a bit of an address here, and he's spoken about funding for both Israel and Ukraine. Now, of course, Ukraine is probably less popular among the Republican Congress than Israel. Let's have a listen to what he's had to say.
Hamas and Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common. They both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy, completely annihilate it. That's why tomorrow I'm going to send to Congress an urgent budget request to fund America's national security needs, to support our critical partners, including Israel and Ukraine, is a smart investment that's going to pay dividends for American security for generations. Help us keep American troops out of harm's way. Help us build a world that is safer, more peaceful, more prosperous for our children and grandchildren.
Michael, what do you make of the strategy of almost linking Israeli funding to Ukraine funding to get Republicans over the line? Is this politically a wise move here?
I think it probably is from a political point of view, because he's got eroding support for Ukraine among Republicans, but Israel is a cause that Republicans feel very strongly about. So he's challenging them to vote down support for Israel. Those who are skeptical about the support for Ukraine to vote down support for Israel. My guess is that will probably work for him.
And, Michael, I want to ask about this bear hug mentality. I've been seeing it. I haven't heard it called that, but I've sensed very much this idea here. And I also want to ask you about this aid that he's negotiated for Hamas. But I haven't seen anything about conditions around releasing those hostages, including quite a number of American citizens. Has the U.S. projected inadvertently even weakness here? And does it tie into his broader sort of agenda around not upsetting the apple cart too much with Iran?
Well, I think it probably has undermined the Israelis somewhat here, because the Israelis were put Gaza under a siege. And their point was, we're not going to lift the siege until we get our hostages back. And the siege is being lifted. I don't want to judge it too harshly, because I don't know all of the diplomacy that's going on around this. There's no doubt that America's Arab allies are putting a lot of pressure on Biden just to ensure that the civilian population of Gaza isn't harmed too much by Israeli actions. Now, we all know Hamas uses civilians as human shields. It carries out military operations from civilian areas. From a international legal point of view, everything that Israel is doing is justified, no doubt about it. And for those of us who were horrified by the rape of Israeli women, the murder of Israeli children, the burning Israeli children in front of their parents, and so on. We just think, go take care of business, do whatever it takes to root this organization out. But we have to be aware, as we're saying this, that Hamas is carrying out a YouTube war that is highly effective in the, especially in the Arab and Muslim world. But even beyond that, you can see the European left and the American left is responding to all of these images that Hamas is presenting, true and untrue.
And I mean, we saw this with the Al Ghali hospital in Gaza City, which was hit, or the parking lot next to it seems to have been hit by part of or a missile launched by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And yet it seemed to me like the media here had already pre-digested Hamas propaganda, taking Hamas, a terrorist organization, at their word that, no, this was Israeli. This was an Israeli piece of ordnance that did this. Are you surprised at how many institutions in the West seem to be so sympathetic to the Hamas and Iranian vision of the Middle East? Does it disturb you a bit?
It disturbs me greatly. I mean, this is a textbook case because the ordnance did not fall on the hospital. It fell into the parking lot next to the hospital, and within minutes, the rumor went all, not the rumor, the report spread by credible news organizations all around the world that 500 people had died. This is how did they know 500 people had died? I have no idea how many actually died from the thing, but the number 500 is already out immediately. And the hospital destroyed, 500 people died. You have people, heads of state, heads of government, tweeting their anger. People in the streets, and they believe it now. It's become a fact for a significant percentage of the world's population that is following this. It's a fact that the Israelis bombed the hospital when that's not what happened at all. So, am I surprised? No, because I've been watching this since the 2006. I was in the White House in the 2006 Israeli Hezbollah war, and Hezbollah presented that as a war of Israel against Lebanese children very successfully, and they've gotten better and better with social media at this tactic. But I am surprised at how little pushback there is to it in mainstream news organizations around the world.
It is shocking, Michael. You see, they say they're killed by Israel, or Israel claims when it's the other side. Michael Doran, I'd love to have you on sometime for a real deep dive about Iranian propaganda, but that's all the time we've got for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, James. Take care.
Now, there's lots more going on, and let's find out what that is with host of Outkick's Tomi Lahren is fearless. Tomi Lahren, thank you so much for joining us on the U.S. Report this week. Big stuff out of Washington, where I saw all of this crazy footage of hundreds of anti-Israel protesters swarming the Capitol building, demanding a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war. Have a look at this. Now, Tommy, I didn't see anybody there in a big Viking helmet, but that looked a little almost insurrection-y. What did you make of it?
Yeah, insurrection-y is actually the exact word that I would use. I'm not sure if it is a word, but we should make it one. Yeah, you know, the left still talks about January 6th. They drum on and on about January 6th. But whether it's transgender students storming state capitals or whether you have pro-Hamas, anti-Israel demonstrators storming the Capitol building, again, it's the double standard that's so infuriating. And then also when you see a sitting Congresswoman, Rashida Tlaib, out there repeating a lie about Israel bombing a hospital, a lie that was disproven before she went out there, it just goes to show that anti-Semitism runs deep in this country. It runs deep in the world. And unfortunately, it seems to also run deeply in our United States Congress, something I never thought I would have to say, but we need to confront that reality. And these protesters that are out there that think that they're protesting for a ceasefire or for the Palestinian people, I think a lot of them are confused. I think a lot of them don't understand the conflict that's actually at play. So I hope that they are simply confused and not evil, but the jury is still out on that one.
Well, Tommy, it strikes me, it's pretty extraordinary that so many people were so quick to believe the propaganda from Hamas, a terrorist organization, that it was an Israeli missile that hit that hospital. It didn't even hit the hospital, and it wasn't an Israeli missile. And yet they're acting like Hamas are the victim. And I'm not hearing any of the protesters saying, hey, Hamas, release those 203 hostages either, am I?
Well, why should they release the hostages when we have our United States President Joe Biden already offering $100 million in humanitarian relief for Gaza and the people of Palestine? They have no reason to release those hostages. And Hamas runs a wonderful propaganda campaign. I will give them that. They are able to rip at the hearts and the minds of impressionable Americans and impressionable people around the world, that they are able to use the plight of the Palestinian people to advance their cause of terror. And that's something to me that's so deeply rooted in the world. It's really unfortunate that it's gotten this bad, but I don't see it changing anytime soon. And I think the demonstrations around the world in favor of Hamas, a terror organization, just echoes that really sad point.
And I mean, Tommy, when people call for a ceasefire, what they're really saying here is, hey, Hamas, you're allowed to go and attack Jews and attack Israel and attack the West with impunity. But as soon as you're done, we'll call for a halt to things so that you don't get in trouble.
You can't call a ceasefire with a terrorist organization.
Thank you.
You know, I am not a foreign policy expert, nor am I an international diplomat, but you cannot call a ceasefire with a terror organization because they do not operate within that international norm. They are not a civilized state. They are not a civilized nation. They are not an ally. They are an enemy that is a terrorist enemy. So you can't have a ceasefire, and anybody that's pushing for a ceasefire is exactly what you said. They're actually pushing for Israel's inability to defend and protect itself. And we all know that as soon as Israel stops defending itself and stops fighting back, that they are at risk once again. These terrorist organizations will not stop until they rid the earth of Jews and Israelis. They have made that clear. Why we don't believe them is really peculiar to me.
And Tommy, I think I love your moral clarity here because, you know, it's not just Israel, it's the West entirely that they don't want to fight back. But, you know, now we've also got, of course, the prospect of potentially 1 million refugees from the Gaza Strip fleeing the war that's between Israel and Hamas. And now on the left, some in America are calling for those refugees to be taken in by the U.S. I don't know. I kind of feel like, given everything that you've got going on at the southern border, and, you know, I'm not sure exactly that the Gazan people might be the most sort of pro-Western civilization types either, pro-American. How on earth would this be a good idea?
Under no circumstance can we admit even a single refugee from Gaza. We cannot vet these people. We cannot accurately document these people. There is no reason to expose our nation to potential terrorism and national security threats. We've already done it with the southern border. 2.5 years, we've allowed millions of people to come into our country under the guise of asylum seeking. So to say that we would bring in millions more from an area of the world that has made it clear that they hate us and hate everything that we're about and stand for, and to label these people as just simple civilians, as if they haven't been indoctrinated from birth to hate Jews and to hate Americans. Not only is that reckless, it's utterly stupid. And that's why we need more than ever a new president in the White House come 2024 to stop the madness. I'm hoping that we get it, because we cannot sustain this on this current trajectory.
Well, you're absolutely right. But, you know, Tommy, the thing that strikes me is how high the rot has set in American society. I mean, Harvard University, supposedly, you know, one of the best universities in the world, oldest university in America, their Arab Alumni Association has appealed for donations to help, get this, students' mental health after they said they were subjected to relentless bullying and intimidation for blaming Israel for the Hamas terror attacks. I don't know. What I know about Harvard, I would think that if you blamed Israel, you'd probably, you know, get a gold star. What's this all about?
Yeah, for some of the most highly educated students in the country and in the world, this really is an embarrassment. And right now they're reaping the consequences of their own actions with employers that are looking at these pro-Hamas, pro-terror students and saying that they don't want to hire them. And for good reason. They have every right to do that. They have every right to look at the people that might be coming into their institutions and their companies and look at somebody who has a pro-terror agenda or sympathizes with terrorism and to say that they don't want that. But these students at Harvard, they are being impacted by this Hamas propaganda, just as so many Americans are. And it's truly unfortunate. Again, I will say, I hope that these students are just confused. I hope that they just misunderstand the dynamics. I hope that they aren't truly evil or pro-terror. But I think that they're going to see the consequences of their actions. And I hope that they see the light. I hope that they change their perspective. And you know what's also interesting to me is these are some of the same students and the same student groups, these liberal students on college campuses around the country that will advocate for pro-LGBTQ all day long. And then on the next week, they will advocate for being pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas. The two do not match. I'm not sure how that escaped them, being that they are Ivy League educated, but it certainly has.
Tommy, I think I heard somebody sum that up as being like chickens for KFC. Tommy Lauren from Outkick, thank you so much for your sense and moral clarity. Really appreciate it. Now, don't go anywhere, because in a moment, we're going to be joined by former White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer with all the news from Capitol Hill. And speaking of Capitol Hill, check out how one Senator James Risch handled it when a pro-Palestinian screamer tried to interrupt his hearing. The words "cool as a cucumber" come to mind.
800 international human rights lawyers called on states to intervene to stop the genocide in Gaza. Palestine need freedom.
18 years ago.
The only time I've seen better than that was back in 2018 when a congressman who used to be an auctioneer used some of his own on-the-job talents to drown out a protester who had interrupted his own hearing.
Please help us, Mr. President, before it is too late, because Jack Dorsey is trying to influence the election, to sway the election.
What's she saying? I can't understand her. Well, half 5, 45, 7, half 50. That's $50 down here to
Officer, will you escort this young lady out, please?
Yep, 2.5 now 5, 65, 7, half 70. Up 2.5 now 5, 75, 7, half $80 to 5, 85, 90. $100 net 10, 10, 10 1/4, 1 1/4, 1 half to divide to 2, 2 1/4. It 2 1/2 to divide 3 able to bomb 300. It 3 1/4. Cut 3 1/4 now half 3 1/2.
Sold to the crazy protester with a cell phone. Sean Spicer with the latest on the Trump gag order next. Welcome back to the program. And in a moment, we'll be talking to former White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer about the other big question on everyone's lips. Do we have a Speaker of the House yet? I don't know. Anyway, but first, one of the most depressing things about the past 2 weeks of war in the Middle East has been the number of people who have been unmasked as being in this great conflict between civilization and democracy on the one hand, and barbarism and terrorism on the other, well, on the wrong side of that. Meet Rashida Tlaib, member of the infamous Squad and chief cheerleader of the U.S. Congress's Hamas faction outside the U.S. Capitol. No, I'm not kidding. Listen to her. Here she is getting all emotional while calling on Joe Biden to stop America's support for Israel.
They can cry. I can cry. We all can cry. If we're not crying, something is wrong. And so I'm telling you right now, President with you on this one. And you need to wake up and understand that.
Not long after, she got a bit feistier with her language.
As a Palestinian American, is also somebody of Muslim faith, I'm not going to forget this. And I think a lot of people are not going to forget this. And it's not a threat. It isn't. They think we're joking. I mean, I think the White House and everyone thinks that we're just going to sit back and let this just continue to happen. No.
Oh, and here's this for irony. We've suddenly got a hard leftist standing up for free speech and not getting canceled for being a Nazi or generally palling around with anti-Semites.
But all of you as well, that you know you're being targeted, you're being gaslit, some people are losing their jobs, folks are getting events canceled, literally their First Amendment right wiped away for standing up and saying that children deserve to live.
Sorry, Congresswoman, the left made the rules here, and if people don't want to hire someone because they've signed on to support a bunch of insane butchers who behead babies, well, maybe I'm for a little cancel culture after all. All right, still have tons more to get through tonight, so let's get into it with my next guest. Joining me now is former White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer. Sean, thanks so much for coming on the program tonight. First of all, I have to ask, what did you make of Biden's trip to Israel?
Well, look, I think that he can give a good speech. He can show up. I give him credit for doing that. But I think we forget sometimes the policies that led up to this. It's American weakness that has empowered and emboldened Hamas to fire off rockets like this. It's the weakness that has allowed Russia to invade Ukraine. It is that weakness that has emboldened Iran, that funds Hamas. I mean, remember, this administration has been dying to get them back into the JCPOA. They had already committed to giving them or unlocking $6 billion. They somehow are shocked by the fact that people are taking advantage of this weakness. And that's the problem I have. The speeches are great. The events are great, but it's the policies that led up to it that are the problem.
And meanwhile, now let's move back closer to Washington here and talk us through, because I think a lot of people here in Australia are looking at the headlines out of America and the Capitol and the Speaker's fight and don't quite understand what's happening here. Now we've got Jim Jordan making a push for a vote, confronting steep opposition. Talk us through this, and frankly, how much does not having a speaker in the chair matter to the Republicans?
Well, for the first part, I would just say I don't think it's just people in Australia that don't get it. I think there's a lot of us in America that are trying to figure out what's happening. I joked last weekend that if we're not careful, we're going to end up with that George Santos, that congressman from New York that has quite a checkered past. If the speaker, obviously, I'm kidding, but the reality is that 98% of the conference was on board with maintaining Kevin McCarthy as speaker. You had just that handful of 8 Republicans that ousted him. And the problem is you need 98% to get to 217. So Republicans hold a 221-seat majority. You need 217 of that 221 to find a consensus candidate. And right now, nobody is getting there. I don't think that this current play, which is to empower the Speaker pro tem, which is the Patrick McHenry of North Carolina, to assume temporary duties, that's not going to pass, in my estimation. And so we're back to the drawing board. I think Republicans are going to have to keep going at this, maybe 1, maybe 2 more times. I think there are a couple candidates that will emerge. The more you don't want this job, the more likely you are to end up with it. It's sort of the way I look at this right now. So I think that we're going to see a little bit longer. And then to the last part of your question, I think for right now, we're okay. Look, the Senate was out last week, so nothing was going to get done anyway. But once you get into that job, there's a learning curve. And I think that we can probably go another couple days, but if we go another week, this is really going to start to get messy. And remember, the U.S. government is on a ticking time bomb for when we'll run out of authority to spend again. And we will shut down the government in less than 30 days now.
And, I mean, this is the question then that comes next, is obviously if you don't have somebody there to pass those motions to get the money coming through, and you've got the United States and a potential war going on in the Middle East, Is that going to wind up being then blamed on Republicans? Almost every government shutdown, as long as I've been alive, winds up being blamed on Republicans. Is there going to be a bigger blowback for the party when it doesn't really need that kind of thing in terms of the global crisis that's going on?
Well, you're absolutely right. With the exception of that one that Schumer blew during the Trump administration, I think every shutdown in my lifetime, as you noted, has been blamed on Republicans. The messaging just doesn't come out well. So if they don't have, if the House Republicans don't have a speaker, it makes the blame a lot easier to point the direction and to point in their direction. So they got to get their act together. And then the irony, by the way, is that the most likely scenario is to pass at least another short-term continuing resolution, which is exactly what they were all opposed to in the first place. So I think the question is going to be about timing. How soon can they get their act together? How soon can they start funding the government? What does the situation in Israel look like? There's a lot of variables, but the quicker they can get their act together and start focusing on the priorities at hand, i.e. funding a government and getting some of these things done, the better. The longer that looms, I think we start entering into dangerous territory.
Yeah, and I think that chaos starts to embolden a lot of America's enemies, too, who look and say, these guys don't have their act together. We can do whatever we like.
I think I would beg to differ a little on that.
Sure.
Look, just because the House of Representatives doesn't have a speaker, you saw President Biden. The U.S. government can act. There's plenty of money there already. We can support our allies. We can fund them. We can send things. Does it help in the long run? No. Does it look good? No. But I think in the short term, I think our allies know that we've got their backs.
Good. But now, finally, before I let you go, I got to ask you about this here, because this really, I think, is a very curious story here. But the federal judge overseeing the election subversion case against Donald Trump issuing a gag order against the former president, restricting his ability, well, they say, to target, people involved with the case, but it sounds like it's a fair bit more than that. And Sean, I think it has a real dangerous precedent here to be having defendants being told essentially they can't talk about their case. It seems like a violation of the First Amendment and, the sort of the ideas of due process that America was founded on. Or am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. I had famed constitutional lawyer Alan Dershowitz on my podcast, The Sean Spicer Show, and I asked him the exact same question and came at it from the exact same angle that you are, which is, how does this work? Where's that line between free speech that we're guaranteed under our First Amendment and this? He came down squarely on the side of the First Amendment. And I think that the Trump campaign and the Trump team is going to appeal this decision and likely win, because the line between criticizing somebody and your First Amendment rights is so small. I have a feeling that this will go up the chain, if you will, in the judicial process, and ultimately the president's First Amendment rights will prevail.
Yeah, Sean Spicer, thank you so much. I've always said you don't have to love Trump to not like a lot of what they're trying to do to get him. Thank you so much.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right.
And check out the podcast, the Sean Spicer podcast. Thank you so much for your time. Now, Mick Mulvaney is standing by, but first, you know that thing we show you every week where members of the press or citizen journalists bail up congressmen in the halls of the U.S. Capitol, trying to get them to answer questions? Guess what? It turns out a few of them don't really get it, and they don't understand a little thing called the First Amendment. Meet Representative Colin Allred. He is a far-left Democrat. But guess what? He does not like being called on his decisions, and he's gone so far as to threaten to call the Capitol Police to protect him from tough questions. Have a look.
Congressman Allred, do you regret calling for the release of millions of dollars to Hamas?
You're on federal property. You can't do this here.
Congressman Allred, do you regret calling for the release of millions of dollars to Hamas?
You really can't do that.
Congressman Allred, do you regret calling for the release of millions of dollars to Hamas?
You really can't
I'll get the Capitol Police for you.
Do you regret voting against Iron Dome funding as Hamas attacked Israel with rockets aimed at civilians?
You're on federal property. Stop doing this.
Why are you standing with Hamas over Israel? Why are you supporting Biden's open border policies?
We'll get the Capitol Police for you.
Why did you funnel taxpayer dollars to a group hosting drag shows for children?
Help, police! I'm being questioned about my job as an elected official. Are the cracks deepening within the GOP? Mick Mulvaney tells us next. Welcome back to the program. Now it's time for our U.S. Report regular, former White House Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney. Mick, thank you for joining us on this very historic week. And I'm asking you what I'm asking everybody tonight. What did you make of Joe Biden's trip to Israel? A significant trip with high risk. He got through it, but is it going to achieve anything for peace and, more importantly, even Israeli security?
Yeah, James, look, it's a good trip. I've set up a half a dozen of these trips for the President of the United States, and it was a good trip. It's a nice, gutsy trip. It's a good show of the flag. It's in the middle of an active war zone, et cetera. He looks presidential. There's no question about it. It sends a really good message both to our friends and to our enemies. Does it change the outcomes any? Probably not. And by the way, that means outcomes in Israel and outcomes here back home domestically for Joe Biden. The president, we fully expect to have him ask for $100 billion worth of support. That's not just for Israel. That's for Israel and for the Ukraine and for a bunch of domestic things. So we have to wait to see if the trip translates into more money back home from Congress. On the political front, he's trying to look like a president. He's trying to look capable. He's trying to sort of beat down those hushed whispers about his mental capacity and so forth. It's very rare, and you and I have talked about this on this show many, many times. It's very rare that foreign policy moves the needle at all in domestic American elections. Joe Biden is going to try and make this into an issue that he can turn into political gold, but it's hard to do that in this country. He's had some really bad polling numbers, mostly on the economy. In fact, almost entirely in the economy. He's still underwater on that, and I don't think going to Israel changes that even just a little bit.
Now, what are the politics here of this? You mentioned before getting $200 billion in funding through. My sense is that the Republicans are very much pro-Israel as opposed to the Hamas caucus you saw there on Capitol Hill with the Democrats and Rashida Tlaib. But, you know, there's a lot more diffidence when it comes to Ukraine. Is tying those two things politically a smart move for the White House, or would they be better off disaggregating the two?
You know, that's one of the gambles that you take. Here's their calculation, and you see this one coming a mile off. It's the same calculation we would make if we're in the same situation as Republicans, is that he knows he can get the votes for Israel. He's not sure he can get the votes for Ukraine, so he puts them all together. In fact, there's talk about throwing in some border security money as well to try and maybe buy some Republican votes. He knows the Republican Party is split on funding for Ukraine. There's probably a majority that would still support it, but it's going to be close. So it's one of those things you do in Washington, D.C. You take an idea that's popular, you marry it to an idea that might be less popular, and you hope that the people who don't like the one will hold their nose and vote for a package. That's what he's banking on. Keep in mind, though, if you get too carried away with that and start to add all sorts of Christmas tree items, sort of everything that you want at one time, that does run the risk of taking a bill down, and then you don't get anything, including the stuff that you might have gotten if you'd asked for it by itself.
And Mick, where is Donald Trump in all of this? I mean, I would think that one of the advantages for Biden is that, you know, not only is he being seen to be presidential, but of course, all of this tragedy and chaos around the world is taking Donald Trump off the stage. I haven't seen any significant rallies or speeches from him, certainly dripping out into social media. Does all of this put up the brakes on his campaign, which until the Hamas invasion of Israel seemed to have a fair bit of momentum?
Yeah, a couple things. First of all, it was not a very good week in court for the former president. His former lawyer pled guilty, and as expected, Sidney Powell is expected to testify against him in the upcoming trial in Georgia. That's not good news. He got slapped with a gag order. That's probably not good news. Again, it's hard to say with Donald Trump because everything that I think would be bad news for an ordinary human being turns out to be good news for him politically. But yes, he has been out of the news this week because of what's happening in Israel. That said, James, he has had to walk something back, and Donald Trump doesn't like walking stuff back. I've only seen him do it 2 or 3 times in the years that I've known him. He changed his position. He came out and was critical of Benjamin Netanyahu and sort of said some nice things about Hamas. That did not go over well, even with the MAGA Republican base. And he has then spent the last couple of days trying to sort of backpedal and support Israel, or at least be more clear in his support for Israel. So again, when I say it's been a bad week for Donald Trump, that means maybe he lost 1 or 2 points, not 10 or 15. But my guess is he was happy to be out of the news a little bit this week because it would not have been a good week for him in any event.
And finally, Mick, one other person who is a bit of an outlier in all of this we've spoken about in the past, RFK Jr. Now, he's had a lot of support, oddly, from people on the right. Hell, there's some things I've liked that he said. But now he's come out this week and said that he's in favor of reparations, slavery reparations, and carving out, some have said, a lane, a pathway to the left of Joe Biden. Do you see this at all playing out in terms of taking votes from one side or the other with this independent candidacy that he's running?
Yeah, James, this is one of the ongoing sort of cocktail party discussions in Washington, D.C. is who does RFK take votes away from? Who does the potential no labels third party take votes away from? Who does Cornel West, who's going to run as an independent, take votes away from? You know, the Republicans think that they're taking them away from them. The Democrats think they're taking them away from them. So it's really, really difficult to say. Kennedy is an enigma. There's no question about it. He's got some libertarian issues. He's got some libertarian policies, got some conservative policies, got some far left-wing policies, as you've mentioned with this reparations issue. So it's really too early to say. I think at the end of the day, he probably only gets 1 or 2%, but depending on the states where that falls, that could change the outcome of an election. Keep in mind, a Green candidate in Florida in 2000 got 50,000 votes. It was less than 1%, but that was more than the margin that George Bush beat Al Gore by. So can these change outcomes? Yes, but no one really has any idea this far out from the election who's benefited and who's hurt by these third-party candidates.
Mick Mulvaney, thank you so much. It may be a cocktail party discussion, but there's nothing wrong with cocktails or parties. Thank you so much for your time. Now, it's almost time for our Only in America, but we've still got some other news to get through. Of course, the big story this week is all the crisis in the Middle East. But hey, remember Hunter Biden? That guy, you know, the guy who gave 10% to the big guy. Well, Americans aren't forgetting, and Fox News took to the streets of America, and people have thoughts. Check this out.
Absolutely. Biden crime family.
I do think they both were. He was kind of a silent partner, but it's proved that he was involved with calls and business dealings. So yes, I do believe that both of them were involved.
I can't say it's a whole lot of nothing because when it comes to politics, there's always a whole lot of something. So I'm leaning towards Biden has something involved.
Unfortunately, with the position that Joe Biden has right now, it seems to bring some protection to both of them. But we've always been suspicious, and without his position, things might be different, and we certainly hope we get to the bottom of it.
Politicians don't get rich by being good people.
They're just money launderers.
Will he get away with it? Well, I'm not so sure. Only in America is next.